Dr. Luke Pittaway.
Hello.
Welcome
Tyler.
to the podcast.
Very good to meet you, and I'm looking forward to talking about this.
Yeah, of course. So the way we got connected was like Haley Allman.
That's right, yeah. Allman, yeah.
Yeah, I reached out and like mentioned that you had read this book and that, that you would love to come talk about it. And I'm really excited. I think the first OU professor to come on the podcast, which is also pretty
that's
cool.
Awesome. Absolutely superb. Thank you.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed kind of meeting you quickly at Donkey, but I hadn't even read much of the book before then. So all of the book I read in like the last 2 weeks, and like it was as the book went on, like it got better. Like it was kind of a slow start, but I really enjoyed it. And like I said, by the end of it, I was like rushing through to finish. Like, what's happening?
That's great news. Yeah. It's designed to be kind of like a really kind of a slow start in the way, because you're really kind of getting that flavour of what it's like to be in England when it's really cold and miserable, and you're dealing with debtors' prisons, and then obviously the transition to a colonial, new, exciting, different, untouched, almost like paradise that you're really getting to, and then all of a sudden it's like there's all these things going on that are kind of trying to undermine that development of the colony and how it's progressing. So it's designed to kind of like be slow and then get gradually faster as you go through it, and obviously talking about the colony of Georgia and the founding of the colony of Georgia, and the
shout out James Oglethorpe.
Oglethorpe's amazing character. It's one of those historical characters that you just look back and it's like, oh, it's really important. And if you go to Savannah and you go to Georgia, you see all sorts of places named after him, and I think people have a general sense of his importance to the state and to why Georgia was founded. But then really when you kind of delve into it in a little bit more deeper, they don't really know that much about his role and how important it was. And he's quite an inspirational figure. Often I think of him a little bit like one of the founding fathers. It's like this guy was he's like in his 20s, and he's a member of parliament, and he's trying to reform the entire debtors prison system in the UK through as a chair of a committee, which is a big deal. And in your 20s, that's kind of a big deal. And then from that, getting into the process of founding a colony. So he's really only in his like early 30s when he's going out, traveling halfway across the world across the Atlantic and establishing an entirely new colony. It's a really quite inspirational entrepreneurial story in that sense, and that's why I got excited about it, because as a professor of entrepreneurship, I'm like, okay, this is a bit different, but it's not capitalist kind of entrepreneurship, but it is entrepreneurship in a very significant way.
Yeah. That's really cool, and I think it's really awesome too that you came from the UK to Georgia, and kind of following that novel that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, that really inspired me. I mean, for me, what I found out about Oglethorpe, he was actually the MP for Hazelmere and Godalming, which is a really small kind of area in Surrey, just outside Guildford. And I was working previously at the University of Surrey, which is in Guildford, and that's right next to Hazelmere and Godalming. And my wife actually worked in Godalming, so I was like, oh wow! So there's a connection that he's actually the MP from the area that I lived.
What does that
mean? Yeah, member of Parliament. So he'd be like a member of Congress or a Senate member. Sure. So it's like a member of Parliament. So he's an elected official of Parliament, and so he was obviously from an area that I was living in, and then obviously made was a fundamental character in making the colony of Georgia start. And obviously that's where we emigrated to. So we moved to Savannah, just outside Savannah. We took a job at Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, and I was like, wow, this is just an incredibly aligned story. And since it is, I think what we're on, 22nd of April, 23rd of April, I'm not sure, but the 21st of April was when the founding documents for Georgia were signed as well.
Yeah, yesterday. Today is the 22nd.
And that's my birthday too. So I was like, wow, there's so many kind of weird like alignments here that I really feel I got to write about this history and this character. And actually when I got to Georgia, I was also like, man, there's these, honestly, people don't really know that much about this history, because for obviously I don't want to offend any Americans on your podcast, but for a lot of Americans, history really starts at the War of Independence and the Revolutionary War, as we would call it in the UK, and so or the other way around actually. The War of Independence is the British term. So it's like but yet there's 200 years, 250 years of history prior to that that tends to get neglected, and so for me, just to have that opportunity to kind of focus on a period of history history that's a little bit before what most people really focus on, and try to kind of really bring that history back to the fore through something that's a bit more interesting to read than an actual
like
history
just
book.
nonfiction. Yeah, certainly. What was that process like, trying to weave in like historical facts? Is it, because you kind of give a little bit at the end of that, like, hey, like all of this fort thing was just kind of all my fantasy, but whatever. Then there's still, so like how do you ride the line of like what's too much fiction? Is there too much fiction in a historical novel?
Well, I think that's a really. I mean, this is my first and second historical book, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on that.
Yeah.
But for me, I think you've got to have. I mean, there's plenty of historical fiction that I read that it's really tenuous whether or not there's really, the history is sort of giving a little bit of a base to the storyline, but actually. It's mostly fiction, but then there are other ones that's like really the history is really underpinning. I think what it does give for me, I feel like it gives you the plot. It gives you a really
100%, like the archetypes again, like the the shitty debtor prisoner like guards, or just like once they're in the colonies, the types of things that happen once Oglethorpe. How am I saying it wrong?
Oglethorpe, yeah.
Thorpe. Oglethorpe. When he like leaves and just kind of whatever, it gets a little hairy and like when the leader goes away, or just even like the way that like he tries to speak in the Indian language and like just so all of those things that like it brought me back, like I could just I could visualize very well like the way that the story was depicted.
Yeah. So I think for me the way in which the plot develops is very much driven by the history. So I read the history, get the underlying the underlying structure and system, and some of the politics of the time, such as Georgia and Carolina, really not being best of friends in many ways, that like really actually competing in many ways, and getting some of those underlying systemic structural things and getting that into the plot. But then I also really like delving deep into some of the details. And so, although I'm not a historian and I would never want to be a historian, I'm not detailed or enough to go and read letters and do the real kind of historical work that a typical historian would do. I'm thankful that they do that work because I found a couple of really good sources and some original archive material, and that provided me with some details that you just wouldn't know otherwise. So some certain things that you learn about Oglethorpe, like he was an archer and he had a longbow, and that he actually spoke. He learned the Indian dialects before he got there, so that he could negotiate. A muskegee. I was trying to remember the name of the actual particular Indian dialect. So he learned that before he got there, and he was called the father of the colony because everybody just respected him so much. He lived in a tent. He never left the tent.
Again, right? Like those things that command respect. Like it just the way that they call him father, right? And then even like the old Indians that are older than him, like they even refer to him as father as a sign of respect. And so Tom
Machichi, for example, is just fascinating. So he's the what's called the Miko, or the leader of the Yamacraw Indians, which is the tribe that was there. It's a kind of an off branch of the Creek tribe in that region, and so he was in his late 80s at that point, and was died in his 90s, and so for him to actually refer to effectively a colonist, somebody who's come to live nearby, and to join them as father, and he actually referred to him as father, which is quite and this guy's in his 30s. Tom Machichi, for example, there was a lot of effort to set up schools for the Yamacraw Indian
there's like
kids,
a part of the negotiations.
That's right. And they also converted to I think obviously Anglicanism, which would be Church of England at the time. So there's a lot of kind of like really intricate stuff there between, and a very strong and good relationship which lasted for about 150 years to the Trail of Tears, which is a whole period we don't necessarily want to talk about right now. But Andrew Jackson caused.
So like it is the part with like because all of the scene of like the Indians coming out and like their columns, and he's just like kind of identifying, like you can literally see that they're different tribes just based on how they're dressed or things like that. And they're it's like the one group who was maybe a little frustrated and they took off. Like I mean, I could just like again, right? I could picture that happening in real life.
So that's interesting because the bit you're describing is the lower creek. So I mean, the complexity of the tribal history in that at that period was really complicated, and so you had upper creeks and lower creeks that were the main allied tribe to the British in Georgia, and the Yamacraw Indians, which were the ones around Savannah, were an off branch of that group of that tribe. Effectively, they were all one tribe, but had different branches. But what you're describing is actually the tribal houses. So they had like you'd have like the Alligator clan, and you'd have the you might have so these were actually clan houses. So that's how the tribal system was organized. They were actually in clan houses. So these were all part of the same tribe, effectively the lower creeks, but they were different clans within that tribe, and they all had different kind of dress, and they have their own clan houses, and their own different components to their clan. So it's that was and as far as I understand the Creek Indians and their history, that was part of their kind of way they managed their clans.
Yeah, because like at first, it's just kind of like the idea that Tom has once he learns that a portion of the land that they're like building on used to be somebody else's land, and just like feeling bad, whatever they're calling it, the new world, just like that. But then that acknowledgement that it's new to us, but not to them. I mean, all of that is just so interesting.
And that's actually pretty specific as well, because there's a tribe called the Yuchi, which is a much older tribe that actually, when you think about tribes, they don't really own land as such. Yes. They don't own property. That's not part of their kind of philosophy. They are part of the land. But this was their historical tribal grounds, the Yuchi, which was the bit of Georgia that was the Creeks gave to the Georgia settlers. And so what happened was that they obviously weren't particularly happy about that. The Yuchi, however, had been decimated a lot earlier by smallpox, when many of the tribes had got decimated by smallpox, and so they'd been basically adopted into the Creek tribe. And so obviously they so that actually, I mean, that actually is historically accurate.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. So I think the other thing that's for me is quite interesting is the English, the bit in London where you're really looking at debtors' prisons and how debtors' prisons
just work. The way that you could get extorted in there. It's like you're never going to get out. But something that confused me, like why? So there were the people in the debtors' prison that had money and like could furnish their rooms. It's like what are they doing in debtors' prison if they could afford? Like I don't. It didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, so it's a really weird institution, because obviously we think of the word prison and we think of prisons as they are conceptualized today, but a debtor's prison is really basically totally different from what we conceptualize as a prison. So basically, if you have debt and you don't have enough money to pay that debt off. So let's say, just take a mortgage, and you get into a situation where you can't regularly pay your mortgage, then you would be thrown into debtor's prison. There's no such thing as reorganizing your debt or bankruptcy, or there wasn't a way to get out of being in debt with somebody if you got into a situation where you couldn't pay your debt off. So if you did have like debts that were more significant than you actually had your assets to pay the debts, then the person that you owed the debt to could ask for you to be put in debtor's prison. And you can imagine how that was exploited. Like, if I don't like you very much, and I think that I want to penalize you in some way, I can claim that you owe me money. And if I win that claim, and I have the power to win that claim, you could get put in debtor's prison, even if you weren't really in debt to me. That was possible. Plus, if you were in debt but you still had money, you were in debt to a degree that you didn't have enough money to pay that back, you would end up in debtor's prison. But the problem was, when you get put in the debtor's prison, was then that it was basically a private prison. And so the person that owned the prison, that had the right to manage the prison, had all these what they were called turnkeys, that were really the criminals, the real criminals. And they basically, once you were in there, you got extorted. So every single thing that you had to pay for, and you had to pay for your room, and you had to pay for visiting rights. You had to pay for everything. It was like a kind of way to extract every single penny that you had left out of you. So usually what happened was somebody was getting debtor's prison, they couldn't get out, they would have to, they would get extorted, and then they would end up in the poorhouse, and then in the poorhouse you ended up with smallpox and died. So it was usually like you got in debtor's prison, that was it. It was a death sentence effectively. And what was also super interesting about it is you can come and go, and families come and go. So it's not like prison in the sense that it's like excluded and you're in there. You can pay a toll to leave, but you have to come back, and if you don't come back, they send out the constable, and they're going to arrest you and bring you back. Families sometimes lived in the debtors' prisons.
Yeah, there's like an example of that in the book.
Yeah. So it wasn't like, and then of course there was genuine torture and other sort of medieval practices within the prisons to further extract, to extract money, but also to just for the vindictive, like
malevolence,
malevolent, horrible
evil for
people.
evil's purpose.
And so in for the research, I actually read a lot of the parliamentary papers and the information that Oglethorpe's committee. So Oglethorpe ran a committee that had the debtors' prisons. Try and reform the debtors' prisons, and it's like because he had a friend that actually died in the debtors' prison, and as a consequence of going into the prison. So they set up this committee and they investigated it, and so I used a lot of the information from the investigation of the prisons in how I formed how the book, the debtors' prisons were. But for most readers today, when you look at that, it's like that's why it doesn't make sense, because it's like it didn't make any sense. I mean, it actually didn't make sense when you look back in history. It's like, why would they organize it like that? And they thought at the time, why would we organize it like that? And so, but what happened is when they did finally reform them, then they had large unemployment and large numbers of people on the street. And so they're like, well, we need to do something here. And so this idea of creating new colonies with people that are unemployed and repatriating them to those colonies came out of the reform of debtors' prisons. So even Australia is kind of linked back to that, if you think about it.
Didn't at the end of the book, wasn't there an acknowledgement that like it was not a large portion of the settlers that actually came from the debtors' prison?
That's correct. So when you look at what actually happened with the settlers in Georgia, although the conceptualization of Georgia was like, oh, we're gonna set up this new colony in order to repatriate these debtors. That was the original kind of underlying reason for why they did it. In actual fact, they didn't end up really settling any debtors. I mean, as far as I'm aware, there was very few debtors.
You mean like settling debtor? You mean like the example of like Tom like being in servitude to this like to like the noble family or whatever?
Yeah. So the idea was that what they wanted was what would be described as yeoman farmers. So people who had small plots of land that would farm them for themselves, and then restart, basically restart their lives. And so the idea was that these unemployed people that had been kicked out of the debtors' prisons, when the prisons were reformed, would go and would actually start a new life in Georgia as yeoman farmers, and therefore reform their lives and begin again. And it was also slightly pragmatic in the sense that South Carolina was considered to be a soft underbelly of the colonies from Florida, from the Spanish Florida, because it had these large plantations with very large numbers of slaves, and as they weren't able to defend that, and so they were like, well, if we put this buffer colony in Georgia and we get lots of yeoman farmers and that's one of the reasons why slavery was banned in Georgia, then that will become a buffer for Spain, because then there's a large militia that could fight if somebody tried to invade from Florida. Yeah,
versus like why would a slave give a shit? Like that makes sense. That's really cool. I've never heard anybody talk about that, about trying to abolish slavery hundreds of years before
so
Abe Lincoln.
1734, they abolished slavery in Georgia.
For 10 years it was?
Well, I think I was looking it up. I think it was actually 16 years in total. And it is interesting to really speculate about why, because there is that argument. It's like it was purely pragmatic. It wasn't like there wasn't any underlying philosophical... They
disagreed with having slaves.
No, so there is an argument that there was nothing to do with that it was purely pragmatic, and that they were trying to create this buffer colony where, and they didn't want slaves in there because they felt that would undermine, if you have these large plantations with just a few few settlers and lots of slaves, and then the Spanish invade, then those are susceptible to rebellions and they're susceptible to collapse. And so it's not a very good strategy if you're trying to defend at that point 12 colonies. And so they put the 13th colony, make it a buffer state, have lots of yeoman farmers in there, and then you've got strong militia should the Spanish invade. That's the pragmatic argument. But when you actually look at Oglethorpe, which is what I put in the book, I mean, and there's a really good new book out there that you can read about his involvement in the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement. When later in his life, he was a key player in the abolitionist movement. He did actually malumete a slave who's called Job in the book.
Job Jolly.
Yeah, and that's actually a real character and he was a prince in in West Africa region, and so that he actually was freed from slavery, which is manumitted, because Oglethorpe met him on a boat, and they had conversations, and he convinced him to come out against slavery, and so he made him free, and then the guy actually became famous for he actually translated the Quran.
Arabic.
He translated the Quran, and he worked to the British Library, and then he eventually went home. So all the fighting stuff in the book is kind of made up, but what was super interesting about that is there's also that gives you evidence that Oglethorpe actually genuinely didn't believe in slavery and wanted slavery to be banned. And so there's this kind of argument in there whether, was it pragmatic or was it actually philosophical? Was it really genuinely? And if it is philosophical, it's like, I don't know, I forget how many years it is, but that's like 160 years, 156 years, whatever it is, before the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's kind of like, that's a big deal. It's like that part of the US had slavery banned, that over 100, more than 150 years before it actually became banned in and also it's the first place in the British Empire as well. So it's significant.
And then also, there's the one point where, is it Mary Musgrove?
Yes.
So she's like kind of explaining to those slaves like their options, like you can go this way. Is that like factually relevant? It's kind of like the atmosphere. It's like the Spanish might free you, but they might just skin you. So
that actually is pretty much factually relevant. So for example, at that point in time, obviously Georgia was somewhat under pressure from South Carolina, and actually a lot of the reason Georgia ended up reintroducing having slavery was because South Carolina, there was a strong South Carolina lobby that eventually removed the trustees in the original founding of Georgia for a royal colony. So it became, and that was also why it was interesting, because it was basically a company. It was set up to be like a philanthropic social enterprise, not a royal colony. And so it had a board of trustees, and it had propaganda to recruit people, and it had newspaper articles, and it had a prospectus, and so that bit was super interesting for me from an entrepreneurship point of view. And then you've got that happening, and then South Carolina's going like, hey, we can't have another. This is undermining our whole kind of concept of how we run ourselves. So in the British Parliament, there were lobbyists kind of arguing constantly about whether South Carolina's system or Georgia's system was right, and so there was a lot of pressure on Georgia. So if slaves escaped from South Carolina into Georgia, typically they got returned to South Carolina. But what would also happen is if they escaped and got through Georgia, then there were two things happened. One, the Yamasee tribe, so the tribes that were allied, and there's a bit more of that in the second book, Jenkins Ear. Those tribes were allied with the Spanish, and they were very practical people. I mean, if somebody escaped and came to their tribe, if they were children or women, they would adopt them into the tribe. And there was this, again, I'm not an expert on this, but it was a spiritual thing. It's like if somebody has lost somebody, somebody's died, they adopt somebody from somebody else's community into their tribe to spiritually replace. So, often when we think about, tribal Indians, basically what we would consider kidnapping people, they often were adopting them into the tribe and having them spiritually replace people who had passed away. And so that also created a lot of confusion between the British and the tribes when that happened, because they're like, well, you kidnapped them, and I'm like, well, no, we adopted them because they're, but for men, that wasn't always the case. So men is like, you were either useful or you weren't useful, or you were an enemy. And if you were an enemy, of course, all the things that we know about were not good. And the Amisays in particular were they were known for like skinning people alive and stuff. It wasn't pleasant. But at the same time, if you were an escaped slave, you had this kind of like situation where if they thought you were going to be useful, then they would adopt you and they would bring you into the slave. And so a lot of slaves actually ended up in Indian tribes because they were adopted into the tribes because they were seen to be useful. If you weren't seen to be useful, or you were seen to be an enemy, if you were British or whatever, then your end might not be very pleasant. But what's also quite interesting, again, this comes up in the second book. There's the very, very, very first free black town north of St. Augustine called Fort Mose, or Mose, and that was a Mecca for anybody leaving the British colonies. So the Spanish have a different kind of perception about slavery and how they incorporate slaves into their communities. And in Florida in particular, because they didn't have a large population, their strategy was like, hey, if we can attract people from the British colonies to Florida and let them settle here and allow them to be free, then we're also strengthening our militia. And so the part of the attraction for anybody escaping from the British colonies was like, hey, if we get there, we can go and set up and be free, and we can have our own, we have our own town, and that's actually the oldest black settlement in the States. So
Augustine,
it's free.
Florida, you're saying?
Yes, it's just north of St. Augustine, Florida. It's called Fort Mose. In my second book, I call it Fort Mose because they fortified it for the British invasion of Spanish Florida. But it has a Spanish name I can't pronounce. But it was always called Mose for short, and then it got called Fort Mose.
Yeah. Well, another interesting thing. Sorry, I'm just kind of jumping around to all
that's
these things.
That's fine. That's no problem.
Was like them talking about how the start of Savannah, like they weren't just accepting like Protestants, like they were taking Jews and people from Italy. It's like, was that not common with the other colonies?
No. So it was really, really strict for the. I didn't do a huge amount of research on the founding of other colonies, which I need to do because I wanted to write about some at some point as well. But typically the British colonies were like pretty strict about who was allowed to settle in the colony. It's like you got to be, got to be from one of the countries in Britain. Typically, you have to be Protestant, and generally speaking, they wouldn't allow settlement from other other parts of Europe or other religions. I mean, that was quite an important component at that point in time. So when they did, get Georgia going, they were much more open about settlers from different communities. So they were very, very strict about not allowing Catholics to settle. That was very significant at that point in time because you weren't allowed. Obviously
it's the France and
part of the those wars that were being created between the empires.
Spanish was Catholic too, weren't they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you have that kind of like Protestant Catholic empire undertow in some of the wars that are occurring. It's mainly at that point it's more of an empire colonial type thing, but it was also slightly religious. So they wouldn't let Catholics settle in Georgia, but basically they had right at the beginning they were having Highland Scots settling in Darien, which is again in my second book in Jenkins' Ear, and they were speaking Gaelic at that point, and they weren't speaking English. They had a number of sets of Jewish settlers very, very early on in Savannah. I think Savannah may have one of the oldest what I'm looking for, the oldest. What's the right word for a Jewish church? It's like mosque.
Mosque.
Right,
yeah.
Sorry, I'm just not getting the word there. But yeah, I think it's got one of the oldest mosques. Not mosque. That's not right.
Temple.
Yeah, that's totally
mosque
wrong.
Is, I think,
that's totally wrong. Yeah.
Islamic.
Yeah, that was totally wrong. Sorry. But the oldest temple in the US in Savannah, and then they had. Salzburgers from Germany, and they were so that they allowed a lot wider range of settlers, which was significant because it then created a great deal of diversity in all sorts of ways. And that's one of the things I try and get over in the book, both of my books, is that we get into these kind of controversial arguments today, and then when you look back at some of these points in history, this is way more diverse than you think of, because even the different groups that were being brought there as slaves were coming from very different African tribes.
That was the thing, and like one of the slaves, like towards the end of the book, when he's just like, that's a Mandingo, like he's not with us, like we don't jive.
Yeah,
like even just that hostility, which is so crazy to believe that somebody that had all this evil perpetrated upon them would also just have this hate in their heart. But it's like hurt people. I don't know. It also makes me like anything looking back into the past makes me understand why religion was more important then. Like I don't want to say the world today is not brutal and vicious, but just like good Lord. It makes so much sense why it was important, or just to get good people, like just trust. Like, could you imagine getting on a boat with 150 people you have no idea who they are? Like, it's just all of that. It's just that's a lot of blind faith.
And so I think when you look at these different, and that's I think critical to understand at that point in time is that communities were very very diverse in a way that we don't think they were diverse then, but yes, they were. They were very diverse. Somebody coming from Highland Scotland that's speaking Gaelic is very very different from even somebody coming from Northern Ireland, for example, or from Wales. So even within the nature of the UK and the UK settlers, you've got incredible diversity. And then if you think about all of the different Native American tribes that were there, there's a massive range of different tribes, many of which are not some of them are aligned with the Brits, some with the French, some with the Spanish, some were neutral, some you would change depending on what was going on and how many, the negotiations and the quality of the relationship in terms of the types of gifts that they were being given, and there was a lot of kind of movement going on there, and lots of diversity, lots of differences, and then even for the black population at that point in time, you've got very different tribal backgrounds, and you've got so I build a bit on this in the second book because second book you've got people that are there from Congo. They're called Congolese, and but they're originally 15th century Portuguese, so they're actually Catholic. You've got people from tribes such as the Igbo and the Mandingo, and they're coming in with very different kind of religious backgrounds. You have Lamine, who's I'm trying to remember which tribe he was from, but they have an Islamic background. Same as Job in earlier on
Job
in the book,
Jala,
Job Jala. He's got an Islamic background. So even the complexity in terms of that is really super interesting to me. And obviously at that point in time, they had different. They also had different languages. So one of the challenges was they ended up having to speak English because they couldn't always communicate with each other because they were coming from different tribes and had different languages. And so so I think for me that it does build. You get a chance to read the second book, you'll see it build in the second book. That's like this kind of fusion of really interesting diversity, but it's also a point in time where some of that's starting to come together as a community. It's like these people, especially if you take a look at Fort Mose and the beginning of the first free black town, you've got people from all these different tribes living in that same town, and they're all coming together and building a new identity. And so that for me is quite interesting as well. It's like this shift from peoples from all over, mainly Western Africa, but certainly a bit of towards the north part of Africa, but mostly Western Africa, and they're actually fusing into a new identity, and as they start a new life in the free black town of Fort Mose. So for me that was also super interesting part of it. And then anyway, that's much more the second book, so we'll come back and talk about the second book.
The other thing that was funny to me was like was Job Jala's translator, like talking about transporting slaves that they captured and then being captured and turned into a slave, but it was just like clear that morally he thought what he was doing, like there was nothing wrong with, but then it happened to him, and he's like, "What?
Yeah,
what
yeah,
the hell's there's just mental gymnastics."
Yeah, that complexity is interesting. So for the West Africans, if you were at war with somebody, and if you captured them in war, then you were legitimately put into slavery, and you could be sold. And so that's
like,
part of the
morally, like
morally,
it's just,
that's their moral.
agreed upon the terms of condition. This is war.
Yeah, so they were in and it was perfect. And I think that at that point in time, I would say that's probably a very widely held belief for many societies, that if you were at war with somebody and you captured somebody in war, then that person could be enslaved, and that was perfectly legitimate. And that was the common belief at that point in time. The problem is that if you were captured, at that point in time in that part of the world, it was fairly profitable for the tribes that were selling people into slavery. And so what would happen is they did things outside of the moral code.
Yeah, exactly. Like anything, they extort and they figure out how to juice it.
So he's kind of upset because he was captured by a Mandingo tribe, which is his traditional enemy, outside of the moral code that was predominant in West Africa at that time.
But also, like, how do you validate that it's just a hearsay? You know what I mean?
So,
I said I captured him
so
correctly.
As far as the people who's taken him, like, they don't care. But, in terms of the West African tribal moral code, that was actually wrong. It's like, I was just hunting and you captured me and sold me into slavery. That's not right.
Yeah.
Whereas, he was actually transporting another time slaves from the other tribe, but they'd been caught in war, and that was perfectly legitimate. Yeah. And so there is a lot of complexity in that that I try to unpick. I mean, hopefully I got it right, because it's it's easy to get that stuff wrong and offend people, but at the same time I'm trying to be kind of like legitimately kind of nuanced in some of that real detail and differences that I guess you don't really think about today so much.
For sure, that's what I would say. A lot of it was just like perspectives I've not thought about for a long time, and usually like these ideas just plant like little seedlings, and then I'll be like driving home from work one day and I'll be like, it will come back, that idea or concept.
The other one that's super interesting is that the reason why part of why the slavery industry was actually occurring anyway. There's a huge slavery lobby in the British Parliament trying to maintain it, and this is why Georgia eventually lost its, after 16 years, it wasn't able to maintain its ban on slavery. Is that it was a huge industry, but it's really interesting why it was a huge industry, because it wasn't actually just about the transportation of people in a way that was horrific and just and as we look back in history, it's just like an absolutely horrendous thing. But what was interesting about it as well is that the Spanish had a contract, and so they sold this contract to other countries. So it's got a Spanish name. I'm not going to pronounce it properly, so I won't say. But they have a contract, and they sell the rights to transport slaves to their colonies to another country. And originally the Netherlands had it, and then the Brits had it. But the British were actually using that contract to smuggle goods into the Spanish colonies. So what they would do is they'd have the slave ships, but then within the slave ships they would put all sorts of kind of trade goods that they the Spanish didn't have and the British wanted to sell, and smuggle them into the Spanish colonies. And that's actually part of what's going on with the second book, is that's the cause of the War of Jenkins' Ear. Effectively, that's why it starts, because the Spanish Coast Guard are overzealous, trying to stop that smuggling occur. So they're not worried about the slave ships so much. They're more worried about the goods that are being smuggled within the slave ships, and they're trying to stop that occurring. And so the Coast Guard
what were the Spanish losing by letting those goods go through?
Yeah, well, for whatever reason, those goods were banned, and so the Spanish colonists want them, but the Spanish authorities didn't want to let them get into the colonies, and so, or I assume there was probably some tax system or some method, and they were
that can make sense.
But all of the British ships were trying to avoid that, and were trying to smuggle goods into the Spanish colonies using the slave trade as the way to do it. And so that's what I mean. We're getting into the second book now, but Jenkins' Ear gets cut off in a Coast Guard capturing one of those one of those ships, and then Jenkins is paraded around the British Parliament as evidence of the brutality of the Spanish Coast Guard, and that's what causes the war. That's why it's called the War of Jenkins Ear, because it was really about the Coast Guard, brutality towards the British sailors. Although really underlying it, there's this kind of obviously massive two different empires and lots of desire by the British to capture the Caribbean and the South American colonies of the Spanish. But yeah, but it's anyway. We should not. We'll talk about that book at another time. But that's really the second book.
Yeah, dude. Another thing, just the idea of getting on a ship in 1700. I wouldn't get on a cruise ship now with GPSs and satellites connected to space, like. But like when they said something like there was a point where it was like, oh, we're a month away. How do they're on open water? How do they know that? Is it because of the current, or like at
that point in time they had pretty good. I mean, they really managed to figure out the navigation processes and the wind, and they had a very specific navigation route that they would follow.
See, but how are you? What do you mean you have a navigation route on open water in the ocean in 17? Like, for what?
Yeah, well, you'd have to ask that.
Constellations? Are they using the stars?
Well, I think they've got. You're getting into complexity that I'm not
sure.
Okay.
But
they certainly they were using the stars. They had other techniques that they were able to navigate, but they were very efficient. I mean, really, from about I think like the 16th century. I mean, that was they were regularly sending ships over at that point.
Okay, I didn't realize that. Well, because it's like James Oglethorpe is going to go back to the to England, and I'm just like, you already risked it once. Like But it just kind of seemed like normal.
They were just it's just like getting on getting on an aeroplane and flying across the. It's like they were doing it all the time. But I think there were issues because they did have like in the 19th century they had competitions to solve certain problems in navigation on. So again, I'm not super knowledgeable about that detail, but it wasn't simple. But they had solved a lot of the problems, and they had very specific routes that they would take, and they would, they knew when they needed to leave. They knew what routes they were going to take, what winds they were trying to capture in the routes, and
so smart,
and how long it would take, and where they were roughly. I mean, it was more rough than you would want, but so you look at that. I mean, that was part of the challenge with the ship. There's a chapter on the actual going over, and I managed to find. I was very, very lucky. I managed to find the recorder's notes from the Georgia Historical Society about the trip, and it was literally like 2 pages of like this happened. It was like literally, which was sent back to the board, the trustees, and that enabled me to put together the chapter where the Anne is taking the very first group of settlers across to Georgia, and pretty much everything that happened in that chapter actually happened on the ship.
With like people jumping off and just like I'm taking off, like whatever, I'm not staying around here.
They jumped ship in Charleston and left. And
were those people that maybe were like servants or something, or they were just like I don't want?
Maybe they just thought they'd have a bit. Well, Charleston was already a very established city, so probably they thought they would be in better position at that point. The Oglethorpe, I don't know how much detail I should give it over, but Oglethorpe's dog got thrown overboard, and that actually happened.
Wow. That was in the record?
That's actually in the record. And there's something. Yeah, there's I shouldn't go into too much detail because I won't give everything away. But there's everything that happened on that boat was pretty much in the record, and so I was like, oh, okay, this is actually quite helpful because it was in many ways it was an uneventful trip. I mean, there wasn't really. It was pretty straightforward. They didn't get lost. They didn't have any major storms. They didn't have any huge issues. They weren't attacked. So for that point in time, it was what would be considered a fairly boring trip. There wasn't a lot happening. Yeah. So I was lucky to find that information that I was able to then, because that's an important part. It's like you're on a ship and you're leaving England and you're going to Georgia and you're setting up an entirely new colony and a new life. That's an important
they literally didn't know where they were going when they got there. They put up and they're like, oh, where do you think we should go?
That's an important step, but I didn't want to have like, oh, there's a ship, it went across the water, and that was it.
I enjoyed it.
So I was really happy. I was really lucky that I found that information, because I was like, otherwise it would have been really hard to have that connection between leaving London and arriving in Charleston and then obviously Bluffton and then Beaufort and Port Royal, as it was called then, and then eventually
it's the port in South
Savannah.
Carolina.
So yes, Beaufort, Bluffton area now, but it was called Port Royal then.
Explain to me the difference between a servant. So, like, Tom Ellis is a servant to a family. Mary Hicks is a servant to a family, like, versus a slave. I don't understand the difference.
Yeah. So an indentured servant is. Honestly, often it's under appreciated how difficult and problematic that could be.
Was it like a classist thing?
So basically you got into indenture because you were probably fairly poor. Maybe your family was poor and they sold you into indenture, and so it was but you had contracts. So it was like I would agree to sign a contract, and I would be in indenture for a 5-year contracted period, but I didn't get paid. I did get accommodation and I got food. And then I served that family, and that was my job. So it's like, in a way, it's more like a job, I guess. But the problem was that because you weren't getting paid, it was very hard to get out of indenture once you got into it. So it's like a sort of class system. You're basically in a situation where unless somebody helps you, or you get lucky, or somehow you have a job on the side and you do other things, you can't earn enough money to pay to be able to leave indenture. So basically it was a system that people got stuck in. You couldn't really, very rare for somebody to get out in indenture, and so in theory you'd have a 5-year contract, and then you would have the opportunity to leave the service of that family at that point, and maybe you would sign a contract with another family and do indenture somewhere else, or maybe you'd earn enough money to look out for yourself and not be an indentured servant. And actually, one of the reasons why it was good for indentured servants to go to the colonies is because they're giving out all this land and they're creating farms.
Yeah, there's the gig was like, after
right.
5 years we're going to let you go. We'll give you a little piece of land. You can have a farm on it.
That's right. So I think a lot of indentured servants, the attraction for they didn't have a choice. If the family decided to go, they had to go. They had no choice whether they went or not. But when they got there, they were giving out parcels of land, and eventually there was the opportunity that they might actually be able to get out of their indenture by taking on a bit of land and becoming a farmer.
How much were the settlers paying? How much of the bill were they footing? Right, because it kind of talks about like them ramping up the fund for the colony or whatever, and like how they have to just like load up all these tools, and that was like another thing, right? Like the things you don't think about is like, oh, they had to bring a shit ton of beer so that when they got there, there was some type of morale booster.
Yeah, actually, it's an interesting part of it because it was really a major philanthropic endeavor. So, first of all, it wasn't a royal sponsored colony. It was a company. So imagine like
that's back to the prospectus.
And so they had. I would consider it like I guess a philanthropic effort, and so they raised money. They had donations, and that's in the book a little bit. I didn't overdo it, but they got donors and they raised money. They did get a contract from the state, so they give them some money from the state as well. But they also had philanthropic donors that contributed to it.
Yeah, I guess for the love of the game, like there was nothing they were going to get out of it. Just go figure that out.
They believed in it, and there was both Oglethorpe and Percival who were involved. They were lead trustees for other foundations, and they persuaded the other boards of those foundations to put the money into the Georgia effort, and so they raised basically philanthropic dollars to fund it, as well as eventually they got some stipend, some money from the state as well. But they mostly, to get the first part of it, was totally philanthropic endeavor. It's like pure charitable social enterprise, if you like.
Yeah.
And they hoped to make money. They were going to do silk culture and rice, and so even though there was money being raised and they were creating a foundation and a board of trustees and all those things, they were still hoping that would generate money. So I think today it would probably be called a social enterprise rather than maybe a charity as such. But as a consequence, the board of trustees, the board funded the whole endeavor. So they, when they made arrangements for everybody to get a certain parcel of land, so that everybody got a small
little clapboard house.
A small plot of land in Savannah, and then they had a small farm outside of Savannah, and so everybody got that, and then they had allotments of things like shovels and things that to be able to do it, to farm the land and to be able to set up the houses and build things and so forth. Obviously, they provided lots of provisions, so that's where the beer comes in. There's tons of beer, which apparently was some of the best beer in London at the time, and they provided all sorts of food stuff, and animals were often part of it, although a lot of the animals were moved from Charleston and Port Royal to Savannah. And in actual fact, that's the other thing that's quite interesting. Charleston, so South Carolina, also gifted the Georgians some support as well. So they gave them a lot of rice and
their benefit is like, you're going to be a buffer between us and the Spanish.
That's right. And they at that point, at the very beginning of the founding, they were very happy, and they loved it. It was only later when certain regulations were introduced by the Georgia trustees that then they got upset about it. But at the beginning, South Carolina was super on board. They gave loads of support. They gave money. They gave cattle, which ended up on Trustees Island, which is right just outside Savannah now. And so it was a real a real kind of collaborative effort across philanthropy for the state, the UK government at the time, and then also South Carolina supporting. And but obviously everybody had to take a risk. They were, many people. I mean, you saw that in the book. I think maybe as much as maybe 55% of the population died in the first 2 years from smallpox.
Yeah.
So settling a new colony wasn't to be taken lightly. I mean, it was quite common for new settlers to get smallpox and die. And it happened in Savannah.
Yeah, like the way you depicted, 6 weeks had passed and it looked like they were 10 years older, right? Just like the look of grief on people's face, the waft of death, brutal.
Yeah, that is really, I mean, you can go to the graveyards now and you can have a look around Savannah, and it's like, man, and partly I could see that because there's a list of the settlers. So that's one of the things I had when I first started on it. I was like, I've got a list of the settlers on the Anne. So that's where Tom comes from.
Yeah, you were like, Tom's basically fully made up.
So he was actually a listed settler.
Yeah.
And in fact, all of the characters are in there were listed settlers on the Anne. But the problem is like many of them disappear or die very early on, and so actually you can see from the list of settlers, because they give their birth and death rates, they arrive, and then literally like half the first ship have died in the first 2 years.
Which was smallpox. Like one of the things, like when they were taking off, there was supposed to be a second boat that was supposed to come a couple months after. It's like, hey, let us go figure it out. We'll get it posted up.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like they already had that figured out. Of like,
there were loads of boats. I mean, the first settlers. They arrived, they started everything off, and they got things going. But there were boats coming a lot, and you rapidly see, and again, you can see it in the other book a little bit more, but you rapidly see other towns starting to get established, and so Savannah obviously being the first, but it didn't take long before there were settlers coming from other parts of Europe and from the other parts of the UK and also South Carolina. Some people settled from South Carolina and started new towns, and so it was pretty rapid actually. I mean, it was this is other things like you got to kind of imagine it's less like an entire. Almost an entire country taking off in like 10 years. I mean, it's just phenomenal what it must have been like to experience this influx of people and the building and new churches going up and new houses and farms going in. And it must have been quite like a gold rush almost, I would think.
So they were giving people small plots of land, but then pieces of, like, I don't understand. Why didn't people just live on the farm? Because they wanted to be in the little community? Was it safer?
Well, for the very first settlers, there's a defense thing to consider. Even though the Yamacraw Indians were very friendly, and they still had the Spanish and the Yamaseys and other people to be aware of. So Savannah was set up, but it did have a wall around it.
That's like the 2-page pic, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it did have. It was protected, and so obviously they had a house and a plot of, a garden effectively in Savannah, which we've laid out in the way that it is today, and but they were also given land outside Savannah so that they could eventually set up a farm.
But specifically for like agricultural output, for a crop to sell.
Because the whole idea was that they were going to be yeoman farmers, and they weren't, and there were some really strict things to stop plantations establishing. So again, this yeoman farmer thing is quite important.
What does yeoman mean?
It means like just like imagine. Well, I mean, think of the farms around here. There would be yeoman farmers,
Just like small family farms.
Small family farms.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it means. So, but they did a couple of things. One was you weren't allowed to sell it. So you couldn't take. So they didn't want parcels of land being built into big plantations.
Yeah.
So they were trying to avoid the South Carolina model. So they were like, it can only go to the eldest child, or So there was kind of really strict provisions on how the land could move from one person to the next, and you weren't allowed to sell it. And the purpose of that was to prevent large plantations starting, to avoid that savanna model, and to ensure that they had a big population that of smaller farm holders and small families, so that they had this buffer colony of this and a large militia should they need it. If the Spanish, they did end up, which they did, obviously end up in a war with the Spanish, and so that was why they did that. And so the farms weren't very big, but they were big enough to be a family farm effectively.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So what did you enjoy most about the book then? That's just
again, without the details, the ending really got me fired up. But I just like something else I really enjoyed was like the depictions of the Indians, and it was just like these really subtle things where like Tom talks about learning from Sin and Hilly?
Yeah. It's Sinalucci and Hilly Spilly and they're actually real. Yamacraw Indians, because they actually went back to Britain with Tomochichi when Oglethorpe went back.
What are they going there for?
So they took them back. I mean, there's pictures of them in London. You can find, I think they might be in the book, of a Yamacraw delegation going back with Oglethorpe, meeting the King of England, and meeting all the aristocracy. And I
just feel like, why would the Indians care about any of that?
Yeah, no, I don't. It was, I guess, it was part of the building of the alliance and building the relationship. And
why would they trust to get on the boat? What do they know about the boat? I guess they know all these white people are showing up. It's like they must have some sort of trust.
It was. I'm sure it was maybe. It was at least a year after the beginning of the settlement. That they went back, maybe 18 months, I think. But yeah, so they all went back. And Sinalucci and what's the other one? Hilly Spilly and Sinalucci, but they call them Sin and Hilly because it's easier, obviously.
Yeah.
They were legitimate Yamacraw Indians at the time, so I incorporated them and made them Tom's.
Yeah,
Tom's
the whole time. So like I loved all that, and then it's just like kind of the small things, like the way that they like just like grab a whole bunch of herbs and like make this little mush and put it on there and wrap it up, or the way that like Tom describes like learning like just how to kind of like move and how to see something move like between the trees, and then like the comparison of like towards the end, right, when he's like Tom, the white guy, is like, wow, this guy's thinking like a white guy, he's just running into a plane for no reason. If he just would have ducked into the trees, I never would have saw him. So like just to kind of, you can see Tom like learn from them and just like see their perspective, and but also like Indians who just like the Indian culture is sick.
So I really wanted to capture that kind of like. Because when you think of colonization, you always think of colonization as a one-way street and kind of really negative in many ways. But in actual fact, at that point in time, for most of the Native American tribes, they were giving back more than they were gaining in many ways. So I mean, for example, like even there's little bits in there that you don't maybe notice, but simple things like the frying pan. I mean, the frying pan is coming from. More of a Native American. Most of the foodstuffs, most of the way in which the food is incorporated into, for example, it's the South. It's grits. I mean, grits is not a British thing. If grits comes from Native Americans.
They were like, this thing sucks. I'm never gonna eat this, and it was like grits, and I was like, that's so popular.
So that's partly because I don't like grits. So I put that in there because of that. But although I must say I have had good grits, but.
Cool.
But yeah, I mean, and so and I think Native American approaches for treating medical needs is it was very advanced. It wasn't it was different, but it was very advanced. And and at that point in time, the Brits are sticking. Getting leeches and sticking them on you, and
bloodletting,
and doing bloodletting and putting maggots into the wounds, and which actually does work. But in general, their medical kind of knowledge was pretty weak, whereas actually the Native Americans really knew what they were doing in terms of using medicinal herbs and various other things. So I was trying to capture that as and then the nature of warfare itself changes radically for the British because. The riflemen, that's where that comes from, is because they suddenly realize, well, if we're going to, we're in the middle of a forest and we're wearing red, that's going to really be dumb.
Yeah.
And if we start walking in lines in the middle of the forest, that's going to be dumb. And soon just as they got more involved in, the nature of warfare and also hunting and all of the things that they engaged with when they were working with their Native American allies, they realized that, actually we should do what they do. That's the way to fight here. And if you think about it, that's actually becomes super important when you get the British American Revolution. It's like, well,
guerrilla warfare.
It's like that because the British were still largely doing red coats and lines,
firing lines,
and the Americans are like, well, we know this territory, we know this landscape, we're not going to fight like that. That's really dumb. We're going to fight more like the Native American tribes do. And so that kind of a lot of the things that get adopted, they come from the Native American tribes, and so and so I try to capture that a little bit. I wanted to make sure that it was showing, we were being kind of legitimately showing that
you can follow the imprint that the Indians have on Tom kind of like throughout it, it's really cool. And just the idea that even that he's like fascinated kind of to like one side, it's just like the white people come in and they're just like, get out of our face, like we hate you, we're taking all your like that, so then just even that the perspective of him just being genuinely fascinated with things and like realizing that he has to accept this tomahawk, like it would be a really great sign of disrespect to not take it, and like giving the muskets back, which that's actually a good point. So because I never really understood, so a musket, I thought a musket was like a muzzleloader, right? Pour some powder in, throw a musket ball. What is like the rifle? Is that like a traditional muzzleloader where it has a different bullet with the the rifled barrel the only difference?
Yeah, so again, that's a very totally American invention. I mean, and so I also try to capture that. You see this a little bit in the cobbled streets in Port Royal and eventually Savannah. That there were innovations going on with the colonists that weren't going on in back in Britain, and so. Part of this
by nature of design, like they needed to use it a little more vicious.
So they were doing more inventive things, and there's only two brilliant good examples of that. The one is taking the ballast from the ships and turning it into cobbled streets. It's like, well, why didn't we do that in England? We're working through these muddy streets and it's raining all the time, and we're trying to get,
like right when they get there, they're like, holy shit! It's
like, why wouldn't we just do the cobbled street thing like they're doing with the ballast? And they had all this ballast they had to get rid of, and they're like, well, we'll use it and we'll make cobble streets and maybe we'll build buildings out of it or whatever. So there was that, but also the Pennsylvanian rifle, very important innovation and invention, and that's where the rifleman comes from. It's a different type of gun, and it has a longer barrel and it has a grooved. It's grooved inside, and so when you shoot the bullet, as opposed to a musket, which is a musket ball, same type of ball. It's just coming out of a smooth barrel and it would go like, I don't know, 40 yards if you're lucky. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Pennsylvania rifle spun
like a spiral on a football. It's a centrifugal force that like allowed it to fly straight.
Yeah, and it was. I think it was invented. I've had this argument with somebody when I was having a drink, a good friend, and we were trying to work it out. But I think the first rifle was like 1720s in America.
This is like 1730s.
And this is the 1730s. So the rifle is invented, and he's given a rifle.
Right when he gets there.
Yeah, the problem with a rifle is, and why it was never adopted for anything other than like anything other than like snipers or scouts or people that were doing so small numbers of people who were riflemen. They basically, it was very, very hard to load, and so
because of the grooves,
yeah,
like you're probably getting caught on that.
Yeah,
versus like a musket with a smooth bore.
Ram the ball down past the grooves.
Yeah,
and so it took a lot longer to load. It was tough to load, and so in that point in history, battles were won by the speed in which people loaded and fired.
Which was really cool when Sin and Hilly were reloading and letting Tom shoot. Like I was like, teamwork, baby, teamwork.
Yeah. So that for that point in time, it's like if you can, and that's what the Redcoats were always really strong at. That's why the Brits used to win loads of battles because they were very, very quick at loading and firing, and the musket was
just the two line, right?
Fantastic.
First people shoot, they go back to reload.
But the downside of musket, it doesn't go very far. You've got to get really close to get a good shot, and if you're too far away, it goes high, it goes low. It's like it's not it's not great. So you have to have large numbers of people in lines in front of each other, not far away, and load and fire quickly, whereas obviously the rifle didn't displace the musket initially because you couldn't load it very quickly, but it was you could shoot a lot further. I mean, hundreds of yards. I don't know what the full extension of a 1720s rifle is, but I would say 200 yards at the max. And it was much more accurate. I mean, so snipers and other people could fire with it. That's quite a significant part of that, because that's also part of the American shift, where it's you're starting to see this different type of fighting, this much more like Native American strategies, and using the forest as cover and running and attacking it and retreating and doing having ambushes and. But also the rifle then becomes important because then you can shoot from a long distance, you can snipe, and you can do other things. And so the nature of warfare is quite radically changed by that. And you're starting to see that happen during that period and that's why I made Tom a rifleman. But really most South Carolina and Georgia would probably have maybe they would have had 20 riflemen for the whole colony.
Oh, wow.
It wouldn't have been in the second book I make it a much larger regiment, but the truth is that they had lots of rangers, they called them, but not many of them would have been riflemen. Yeah, because they were expensive as well. These weapons.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's awesome. Yeah.
So I'm going to have to get you reading the second book now.
Dude, I have to, especially too. Like you get me juiced up for it during this thing, talking about little snippets of it. But.
Yeah, and it was. I could talk a little bit more about. Why I wrote it as well.
Yeah, just the process of it for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, what was fascinating was this idea that you can really go somewhere. And I obviously I was emigrating. I was working in the UK actually in Sheffield at the time, and I was like, I'd got the job in Georgia Southern, and I was like, wow, I had a semester time off, and because they passed my teaching out to other people, and I was like, well, what do I do now? I'll read a bit of history. So I got really into the history, deep into the history. George was like, I'm going to go to an entirely new location and settle. I should know something about that part of the world. And so I started to read stuff, and I think I got lucky, I think, because what happened is that I was reading about Georgia history using a British library. So I found some books that I don't know that you necessarily would have found here. There was a 1930s biography of Oglethorpe, and I read that, written by Ettinger. It's like, I can't remember the date of it.
Well, 1930s is like 200 years after. Where are they getting this information?
So he wrote a...
James, you're saying?
Ettinger. This is Ettinger, yeah. And he wrote this really incredible... And I've read other biographies of Oglethorpe since, and none of them are anywhere near as detailed and as well researched. This is a superb piece of historical research. And it covers other parts of his history and his thing as well, but it's super interesting. I read that and I was like, and that's where I got a lot of the details from. It's like, wow, this guy, he spoke Muskogee, and he had a longbow, and he was an archer, and they called him father. And so I really learned a lot of details that I don't think I would have found if I had not read that book. And so that was kind of, for me, then when I got there, I was like, I started to talk to people, and it's like, really doesn't know anything about this guy, and it's like
Yeah,
amazing.
you came and immigrated to Georgia and immediately knew more about Georgia than anybody in Georgia.
And I had a semester, so it's, I did read, and I'm a professor, so of course I read a ridiculous amount. I'm not a historian because I couldn't do all the detailed research that a proper historian does. I just wouldn't have that level of patience. But going to read letters and that kind of stuff. But I was like, man, this is super, super interesting. This guy is amazing. And I got there and it's like, oh, a few things are named after him, and a few people have heard of him, but actually they didn't know anything. And so that was a pretty major motivation when I got there. I was like, oh man, I have to write a historical fiction book here because this is a history that people should know more about. And then, really that's where I am now. I'm like, I'm really interested. I'm an entrepreneurship professor, so I'm interested in founding and starting things and
but
the beginning
this was
of
like
things.
12. How long ago was this?
This would have been 17 years ago. When
so you wrote this book when you were in Georgia?
Well, I started at that point. So I've been a lot quicker with my second book. But I started at that point. I was like, I really need to write, and so I started to write then. And so that first book is, it's probably 10 years in the making in total. Writing, but also going through the process of actually getting something published, because it's not a simple process. In that space. And so I was like, man, I've just got to give this I've got to do something here. I've got to write it so that people know more about this. They really need to know more. Now my problem is I've got to get people to read it. So it's like, especially in Georgia, it's like, you need to read this. It's important. But it also has given me a little bit of a passion for like founding stories of colonial North America, because I'm like, man, there's loads of this stuff. I mean, there is a lot of early founding stories that are really super, super interesting, that I don't think many people know anything about. And it's like, I really think that should be something. I mean, admittedly, American history tends to start at that point that it starts, but there's this stuff before it is actually super interesting too. Like, so for example, William Penn is an interesting character. I'm doing some reading in the bit that I'm looking at right now that is all centered around Lawrence Washington, which was George Washington's half brother. And there's nothing on him. I mean, I literally have been doing some research on this. It's like there is like letters that Lawrence and George wrote to each other, and there's a little bit in the major biography of George Washington about Lawrence Washington, and then there's nothing. But yet Lawrence Washington, actually owned Mount Vernon. He named it Mount Vernon. Lawrence Washington persuaded George Washington to go into the army. I mean, there's a huge. I'm not going to say any more than that because I will write a book around his history. But there's super, super interesting stuff. But he doesn't feature anywhere in the history. It's like, and actually, even from for me, I'm writing historical fiction, so I need something to work with that somebody's already done the history. I'm looking at it going, we need a historian. Somebody needs to actually find out more about this guy and read the letters and do all this historical stuff. But I don't want to become a history professor, so I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
But I do. I have so that one probably will be in that space where you're going to kind of make it up a bit. And that's the nice thing about fiction is like, well, if you have gaps and there isn't the knowledge, if you're a professor, you've got to have you can't make it up.
Yeah,
but if you're writing historical fiction, well, you've got a bit of license. You can have enough to kind of surmise some things, and then you can create a story. And
which
it's
sounds
not,
fun and
it's not
exciting.
terrible, if it's not perfectly correct, because if there's no information, you can't be perfectly correct.
Yeah.
At least with Oglethorpe, there was a lot of information.
It made me smirk, like maybe the acknowledgement in the back or whatever, when you were just like, I was excited to not cite my sources because I didn't have to.
Yeah. Well, that
made me
me,
chuckle.
Yeah, as a professor, I mean, obviously that's the nice thing about having this side gig. It's like, I'm doing creative writing, so I'm writing in a very different style, and that is a thing. It's like, when I first started, I was writing in a passive tone and not an active voice, and that actually is a thing in fiction. You have to write in an active voice. And it's like, okay, so I had to edit everything and change all that. You tend to want to justify everything, and whereas obviously in that type of writing, it doesn't need to be justified, and then of course you've got all the citations that you typically write in an academic piece. So it's like, man, I don't have to. I mean, yes, I've read a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like the research wasn't done, but I don't have to worry about citing it all.
Yeah, it was
I just list a couple of books that were most important, and the rest of it can, because I read a bunch of stuff about dead as prisoners, and that was all like academic papers and historical notes and parliamentary papers and that kind of stuff. And there was loads of that kind of stuff, but I didn't need to cite it all. Thank God for that, because I probably lost most of it.
Yeah, no, that's really funny. Like I said, as the book goes on, like there's a point I just couldn't put it down. I was like, I got to see this through. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think I should say that obviously Yamacraw Bluff is available in the little Professor bookstore. So that's the other thing that I'm really happy about is both those books are in there, and I'm trying to send our Athens locals to the little Professor bookstore to try and get people to get it from there.
Where can they just learn more about you? Like on LinkedIn?
I've got a LinkedIn page. If you want to learn more about my actual, my historical fiction bit rather than my academic bit, I do have a blog website, lukepittaway.com. That's all my historical fiction stuff. And then of course I'm on university websites in terms of like the College of Business, and I think the press bit of the university site as well. Yeah, so it's all out there. I don't have as much like Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a personal Facebook page, so that's one of the challenges I've got. I've got to build a bit more social media presence as I go forward.
Same with this podcast, man. I'm not a big fan of social media. I deleted all my stuff kind of like during the pandemic, maybe, and then I brought it back for this podcast. But awesome. So Yamacraw Bluff, the first book, Jenkins here, the second book, Little Professor, which is right up on the corner, catty corner to the big College Green Gateway, Alumni Gateway,
right next to Copeland Hall, right on the Court Street there. Yeah. Yeah, so, and hopefully the third one, Fort Frederica, will come out eventually. But I think it might be a little while. I've got to write it first.
Cool. Well, this is really this is a pleasure. I'm really excited to read Jenkins here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk about the book today.
And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it. It was always fun, and obviously you reflect and you remember some things, and it's like, oh, okay, that's actually I remember that. That's it's like it unearths things that you've definitely thought about, but not maybe talked about so much.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Luke.
That's cool.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.